We're in the book of Acts, chapter 27, beginning at verse 1. And today's message: through the storms in life, your faith must be anchored in the promises of God. The Apostle Paul had appealed to have his case brought before Caesar. So he is being sent as a prisoner on a ship headed to Rome, and he is facing a horrendous storm. But his faith is anchored in the promises of God, who assures him that he and those who are traveling with him, their life will be saved. Life is filled with unexpected storms. And this message is to encourage you to have your faith anchored in the promises of God when the storms in life come your way. Beginning at verse 1, we read, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment." So entering a ship of the Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. And when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we sailed over the sea which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. And when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. Passing with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Paul's journey began by setting sail to Italy, and he was handed over along with some prisoners to a centurion by the name of Julius, who was a officer controlling the Augustan regiment. This lets us know that they were filled on the ship with many soldiers. And when they had entered the ship, I want you to notice that it says the word we. Paul had two friends with him. One of those friends was Luke, who accompanies Paul on this particular ship, and he would be giving a detailed account as to what occurred while they were sailing. Now, the second friend is Aristarchus, a Macedonian man from Thessalonica. Now, we read about him in Acts chapter 19, verse 29, when he was seized during a riot that broke out at Ephesus. Interestingly enough, that Paul calls him his fellow laborer in the book of Philemon in verse 24. And he also calls him his fellow prisoner when he writes to the church at Colossae in the book of Colossians, chapter 4, verse 10. It really is good to have true friends who will never abandon you in your time of trouble. The centurion Julius treated Paul kindly when they arrived the next day in Sidon. He allowed him to go visit his friends to receive care. Now, there is a lot of speculation about why Julius would risk trusting Paul to leave the ship. He's a prisoner and to go to be with his friends. Was it because Paul was a citizen of Rome? Or was it because Julius had heard of Paul's good character? We do not have any details to say one way or another, but one thing is for certain that God was the reason this happened. Time and time again, we see the hand of God's grace opening doors for Paul. And this ought to bring encouragement to you as well, to know that God's grace will open doors of opportunity for you. God will use anyone to fulfill his purpose for your life. When Paul returned to the ship, they set sail along the northern coast of Cyprus and landed at Myra. And because they were sailing into a strong wind, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship that was sailing to Italy, and he put them on board. They continued sailing for many days because of that wind. And how bad was the wind? The trip would normally take, under good conditions now, 10 to 13 days from Alexandria to Rome. But because of the harsh winds, it would take them about 45 days. Now, we are told that they faced more difficulty as they sailed because of the wind, and they finally reached a place called Fair Havens. Next, I want to point out that your past storms will help you when you face unexpected storms. Verses 9 through 12. Now, when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because of the fast. Now, this fast is the Day of Atonement. And Luke records that it was already over. See, the fast started early October, and sea travel would be ill-advised during mid-September. And it would be avoided altogether from November through mid-March. This lets us know that the timing for safe travel at sea was way over. Paul, being no stranger to sailing and being shipwrecked on three previous occasions, he offers some advice. Look at verse 9. Paul says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman, that's the captain, and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Collectively, these sailors and the owner of the ship trusted their own experience over the words of Paul, whom they saw as just another prisoner. What does he know about sailing? Well, what they failed to realize was that Paul had experienced harsh sailing conditions before. He had been shipwrecked on three other occasions. And above all of that, he had experienced the will of God in protecting him. Through those experiences, his faith was anchored in God. And their rejection of Paul's advice would lead them to encounter a horrific storm. And I want to let you know that your past storms and your experience with the will of God, who has protected you in the past, will help you when you face unexpected storms in your life. Just keep your faith anchored in the promises of God, and He will see you through. Next, I want to point out that storms will come when things are looking good. Picking up at verse 13 through 20. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. With the gentle wind, things were really looking good for them as they sailed. But not long after, a tempestuous head wind arose. Now, this wind was called a Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. The sailors, brothers and sisters, they were unable to steer this ship in the direction that they wanted. So they let the ship just run its course. And running under the shelter of the island called Clauda, we secured the skiff. Now, what's a skiff? It's a lifeboat. And it tells us that they secured this skiff, this lifeboat, with difficulty. That's how horrendous this storm was. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. And this would involve tying cables around the ship's hull to keep it from falling apart, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. Now, this is off the North African coast, and it's a site that is known as the graveyard for ships. And why is it a graveyard for ships? Well, this is where all the ships would cause to be shipwrecked and break and fall apart. So it was just a graveyard. They were all damaged ships there. The text tells us that they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest tossed, meaning tossed by the storm, the next day they lighted the ship. What does this mean? Well, they were throwing cargo overboard. And he repeated the same thing on the third day. It says that we threw the ship's tackle overboard, which is the tools and the ropes. And they did so with their own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, that shows you how dark it was, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. They just threw their hands up and said, "This is it." Now, isn't this just like life when things seem to be going good? All of a sudden, another storm will come in your life, and you're unable to turn things around, and you're only left to let things just run its course. But let me tell you something. While you're doing that, you must remember that when things are out of your control, don't give up hope, for God is in control. Amen. What you do when you're faced with a storm in your life, well, if we look at verses 21 through 26, it'll let you know that you need to remain anchored in God's promises. But after long abstinence from food, most likely they were seasick because of being tossed back and forth by the waves the storm had caused. Then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." Let me put it in my vernacular. Paul was basically saying, I told you so, but y'all didn't listen. And maybe you will listen to what I have to say this time around. So Paul says to them, and now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Paul explains the promises that God has made to him. Next, he says, for there stood by me this night an angel of God, or rather, the angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid. Paul, don't be afraid. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Paul's faith remained anchored in the promises of God. He wanted these fearful men not to be afraid because the God he served would fulfill his purpose by protecting him and keeping him alive so he could arrive in Rome to be brought before Caesar. In fact, Paul tells them that they needed to take courage, for God has granted all of them mercy. He also tells them that he believes God will do what he said he would do, but that they must endure being shipwrecked on an island. I want to encourage you to remain anchored in the promises of God. Also, to tell others about your faith being anchored in God, and to let them know that God can extend his mercy to them if they remain anchored to his promises. You have to believe that God will do what he says. And that's the problem with many people. They don't believe what God says in his word. But if you want your faith anchored in those promises, you have to believe God at his word. Even when you are in the midst of a storm, you must remain anchored in God's promises. Picking up at verse 27. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Now, why did they sense that they were drawing near some land and they didn't know for certain? Well, because it's dark. They have no visibility. And in those days, sailors didn't have navigation systems. They relied heavily upon the sun by day and the stars at night. That's what guided them. And they didn't have that visibility. Now the text goes on to say, and they took soundings. What are soundings? Well, soundings is a rope with a weight attached to measure the sea depth. And when they took soundings, they found it to be 20 fathoms. Well, what's a fathom? Well, a fathom is about 6 feet. So 20 fathoms is 120 feet deep. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again. And they found it to be 15 fathoms, which is 90 feet deep. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff, the lifeboat, into the sea under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, sensing that they were ready to escape the ship, which God had promised that all would be saved, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. The centurion and the soldiers finally listened to Paul. The sailors' fear of the storm made them want to escape from the ship. And often when you are facing a storm, you're tempted to escape the trials that you are going through. Some people will escape from their faith because of their storm. They will stop coming to church, stop reading their Bible, stop praying. Some people, when they are facing their storms, they will medicate to escape. Others will use alcohol to escape and even contemplate suicide to escape their storm. Your only true hope through your storm is to have your faith anchored in the promises of God, and He will lead you to peace and safety. Next, I want to show you God's promises never fail. Verses 33 through 44. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival. Now, Paul urges them to eat so that they would have enough strength to swim to shore, for they no longer had a lifeboat to get them there. They needed all the strength that they could muster. And this is why he implores them to eat something. Now listen what Paul says next in verse 34b. Excuse me. Since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. Paul encourages them by reminding them of God's promise. When you or someone is going through a storm, you must remember the promises of God. You can't forget them. You must hold on to them. Look at verse 35. Excuse me. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves, because Paul stood before them and took bread and gave thanks to God. Their fears had gone and they were encouraged. When you are in a storm, your faith must remain anchored in the promises of God, not only for yourself, but also so that you can be a witness to others, so that they can have their faith anchored in the promises of God and be encouraged when they are dealing with their own storms. Verse 37, and in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach unto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and let them in the sea, or rather, and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted rather, the mainsail to the wind and made for shore by striking a place where two seas met. They ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. They had to make a decision, and they said, you know what? We're going to just kill these guys because we have to, because soldiers were responsible for prisoners. And if any would escape underneath their watch, they would have to pay for it with their own life. But the centurion steps in, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. If I was writing this and you know what, I'm just being me. I know Luke is writing underneath the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. When he tells this story, he's giving a detailed account. He says, but the centurion wanting to save Paul, you know what I would have said? I would have said, but God wanting to save Paul. Now I know the centurion is seen as wanting to save Paul, but the spiritual aspect of this is that it is God who wanted to save Paul. The centurion is only being used. And so when they had jumped overboard to get to land, we are told that some of them had to hold on to boards and some on parts of the ship. Text reads, and so it was that they all, not some, all escaped safely to land. That's because they stayed on the boat, listened to Paul. They believed the promises of God. See how important that is? Hear me when I say this. If you keep your faith anchored in the promises of God, He can take your shipwrecked circumstances and deliver you to safety. God can transform your storms into testimony. He can take your pain and transform your pain into praise. He can take your worries and transform them into worship. Having your faith anchored in God's promises can deliver you from your storms. You just have the responsibility of trusting Him. And if you trust Him, He will see you through your storms. God bless you.